presented by Exquisite Timepieces. More about them in the description down below and later in the video. The Grand Seiko SBGY007 Omiwatari from the Grand Seiko Elegance Collection is the Grand Seiko Snowflake for people who don't like the Grand Seiko Snowflake. And if I'm being honest, it might also be the watch for someone who loves the Snowflake but wants something that, as the collection name might suggest, is a little bit more elegant. Now, before we get into the reasons why you should check out the Omiwatari, whether you're a fan of the Snowflake or not, a quick bit of basic information about the watch. The SBGY007 is a 38.5 diameter watch with a thickness just a hair over 10 millimeters. It has a wingspan measuring about 44 millimeters from lug tip to lug tip, and it has a lug width of 19 millimeters. It rides on an amazingly comfortable dark blue crocodile leather strap, and my apologies if the camera doesn't capture the strap color as well as I would like. It's just a little bit difficult to get it in this lighting. But the strap is finished off with a Grand Seiko signed 3-fold clasp with push-button release, and overall the entire package is fantastic. The dial is covered with a dual curved sapphire crystal with anti-reflective coating on the inner surface, and the dial itself is a lovely ice blue textured dial with highly polished markers and an applied Grand Seiko logo. The presentation is finished off with a razor-sharp set of sword-style hands and a highly polished and blued smooth sweeping seconds hand. The watch runs the 9R31 spring drive movement, but it's not your typical spring drive. It's not an automatic. In fact, it's a manual wind version of the spring drive, and it's fantastic. With a 72-hour power reserve and an accuracy range of plus or minus 15 seconds per month, it's a 30-joule movement that is kept to the thinnest possible proportions, thanks to it being manual wind instead of automatic. Now, for those of you wondering, what does Omiwatari mean? Well, I had to look that up myself because I didn't know either. It turns out it means the pathway of the gods, and it got its name and the inspiration for its dial design in reference to when Lake Suwa in central Japan freezes over, and for the effect that is created when cracks form in the ice, some of which stretch for kilometers across the surface of the lake. So let's talk about what potentially makes this watch a contender, or even a successor to the wildly popular Grand Seiko Snowflake. But before we get into it, a quick disclaimer, please hear me out. I'm not bashing the Snowflake. It is a lovely watch in its own right. And I could have just as easily have done a list on the things that make the Snowflake a better watch, because there are things that I like about it better as well. But I think that the Omiwatari might have a few tricks up its sleeve that really make it stand out. No power reserve indicator. One of the most frequent complaints that I hear about the Snowflake is the presence of the power reserve indicator on the dial. Yeah, it's got an asymmetrical layout that some would say clutters up the design. But a power reserve indicator is sort of standard for the spring drive movement. Well, this one fixed that common complaint. The power reserve indicator is now found on the back of the watch. It's neatly tucked away, but still visible through the display caseback, where we can see a small meter showing the power level of the movement. That should make more than a few people happy. It's only 10 millimeters thick. The Snowflake, as nice of a watch as it is, I gotta say it's a little bit chunky. Now, it's not Blvd 7750 chronograph chunky, that's a thick watch. But for a watch that straddles the line between casual and dressy, pushing 13 millimeters in thickness isn't actually what I would call ideal. Well, with the transition from automatic to manual wind, the designers at Grand Seiko were able to trim down the thickness on this watch to a slender 10.2 millimeters in thickness. This, of course, does come at the cost of some water resistance, but if you want a low-profile, under-the-cuff Grand Seiko, the Omiwatari is for you. No more titanium. Nearly as often as I hear complaints about the power reserve indicator, the Snowflake being made from titanium is probably the second most common complaint that I see people make. Now, honestly, I'm not sure why. Personally, I like the titanium, but if you don't, the good news is that the SBGY007 is constructed from stainless steel. And while it is made in steel, you don't sacrifice anything in terms of finishing or in quality. The watch case has a mix of smoothed brush surfaces, which can be found on the flanks of the watch case, and it has mirrored polishing on the bezel and on the tops of the lugs, and it looks every bit as exceptional as the Snowflake. It wears a lot smaller. The Snowflake is kind of big, and that's probably the one reason why I haven't personally bought one. At 41.5 millimeters in case diameter, with a big, bold white dial, it wears too large for my preferences. On the other hand, the Omiwatari wears perfectly at 38.5 millimeters, and I love the size and I love the scale of this watch on my 6 3/4 inch wrist. Now granted, this watch has a drastically different style and a drastically different case design, but it really does wear a lot better, at least for me. The dial is better. There, I said it. Subjectively speaking, I think that the dial on the Omiwatari is better than the Snowflake, in terms of the dial texture effect at least. And if you add in that light blue hue, giving it just a little something extra on top of everything else, yeah, it's a Snowflake dial on steroids. Now, of course, your mileage may vary, and this again is only my subjective opinion, but I think that the slightly more dramatic dial texture found here goes a really long way in making this watch pop in a way that the Snowflake can't compare. No date complication. So to be fair, I am a fan of having a date complication on my watches, but they aren't without their problems. First, when it comes to more formal occasions and with dress watches, generally you don't want any complications. I guess it's a matter of decorum, and I suppose it's one small reason why the Snowflake doesn't dress up as perfectly as it could. Also, a date complication throws the symmetry of the dial off, and while it's definitely a really useful complication, sometimes form is just more important than function. So the bottom line is that because of the lack of date complication, I'd say the Omiwatari dresses up a lot better than the Snowflake. And, like the no-date Rolex Submariner, it just has a cleaner look. Hand-winding mechanical movement. So the last item on the list is sort of subjective as well, but hear me out. A positive for this Omiwatari is that it's a mechanical hand-wind timepiece. Now don't get me wrong, an automatic movement like the spring drive that's found in the Snowflake is super convenient, and I love automatics. But if you've never had a hand-wind only wristwatch, you're missing out. There's just something special about giving your watch a wind every day before you put it on. It's almost as if you get to spend some time every day building a relationship with your watch, and it gives you a minute or two to look at the watch and to enjoy it from a little bit of a different perspective. That, and it's a reminder of how watches used to be made, when they were all manual wind, in the days before automatics were even an option. So that's my list of 7 reasons why the Grand Seiko SBGY007 Omiwatari might be a better watch than the Snowflake. And before you pull the torches and pitchforks out and come after me, like I said, this list isn't an indictment on the Snowflake. I could have easily have made a list from the other perspective, because the Snowflake has things going for it that I think make it a better choice as well. Not the least of which is the lower price and that it comes on a bracelet. At the end of the day, they're both amazing pieces, and you can't go wrong either way. But we all know the Snowflake, and we know that it has a huge fan following. So more than anything, I wanted to share an equally great Grand Seiko that is probably a little bit lesser known. If you haven't had the opportunity to see the Omiwatari for yourself, I highly recommend taking a closer look. It really is a great watch. This video is presented in partnership with Exquisite Timepieces, located in Naples, Florida. Exquisite is an authorized dealer of dozens of watch brands, including Seiko and Grand Seiko, Omega, Oris, Blancpain, Breguet, and many more. Exquisite also has an amazing selection of pre-owned watches with new inventory coming in daily. So if you're looking for your next watch, check their website, exquisitetimepieces.com, or call their store at 239-227-2932, and let them know that you heard about them from Guy and the Just Blue Fish channel. I can't recommend them enough.